All right, let's take our Bibles together. Listen to what God would like to say to you and me this morning. Turn to Joshua chapter 1. Imagine yourself standing along the bank of a river, and you're looking over at the other side at a beautiful, beautiful land. Rich, green, beautiful. That is what is going on in Joshua chapter 1. The children of Israel are standing on the east side of the Jordan River, looking across it to the promised land. These are the people who were children when Moses led Israel out of Egypt. Their moms and dads died over the last 40 years in the desert. They grew up in this desert wasteland. Imagine growing up in a place with no natural water supply and hardly any vegetation. It looked like the moon. That's where these people had always lived. And now they're standing on the bank of the Jordan River looking across at what would just have totally blown their minds. The beauty and the lushness and the green, and God's saying, I want you to take this land as yours. That is what they're doing as they're standing here in Joshua chapter 1. And of course, there's one concern on their minds. What about the people who are living there? We've heard that there's large cities there and that some of those people are giants, and we're supposed to go in and defeat them and take their land. That would have been a very real issue for Israel, and it worried their new leader Joshua. Moses had died. Now Joshua is there, and God knows that he's worried. And so God sends him a very powerful message in the very opening verses of Joshua chapter 1. Look at Joshua 1, verse 2. He says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, cross this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, to the sons of Israel. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given it to you, just as I spoke to Moses. Then jump down to verse 6. Be strong and courageous. Note that. Be strong and courageous, for you shall give this people possession of the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Listen to that promise. Can you imagine? You're going in for military conquest, and the promise is every place on which the sole of your foot treads, you're going to have it. It's going to be yours. What a promise. The rest of the book of Joshua records how this happened. And they crossed the Jordan River. First place is, if you remember, Jericho. And they take Jericho, and then city after city after city after city, they just start going through all of the promised land, defeating these cities that were the enemies of God and possessing them. 24 chapters of victory in this book. And then the book ends and the book of Judges begins. And the opening verses find the Israelites continuing just to do that, to take city after city in the name of God and take possession of the promised land. Turn over to the book of Judges. Skip the book of Joshua. That was a summary. And now Judges chapter 1. And we see them continuing it on. Judges 1:1. Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. Look at verse 4. So Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men of Bezek. All right, here Joshua has died, and Israel's saying, "What? Do we just keep going?" God says, just keep going. And Judah goes in, and this records victory after victory of their taking cities. That verses we just read list 5 cities they took. The verses to follow talk about taking Hebron and Debir and Hormah and Ashkelon and Ekron. Look at verse 18. It says, and Judah took who? What's the name of that city in verse 18? Gaza. Sound familiar to you? That's in our headlines. Just about every day, Israel is still taking Gaza. But it said this was the first time 3,200 years ago. Gaza is a big city, by the way, in the Bible. You may not have known that's where Samson met Delilah. That's where he ripped the gates of the city out of the ground and carried them away into the mountains. That was Gaza. Where Delilah cut his hair. That was Gaza. Where he lost his strength and was taken prisoner and put in prison to grind grain. That was Gaza. And then later, He was taken to a temple in Gaza, a pagan temple, and it was in Gaza that he pushed down the pillars. That's Gaza we're reading about in our headlines is an ancient city with ancient conflict with Israel. It's still going on today. Well, here in verse 18, they took it, and it belonged to Israel. Now look at verse 19, which is our key verse for today. Verse 19. Now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country. But they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had iron chariots. Okay, here's a problem. Israel had no problem, it says, getting victory in the hill country. But the valley was a different story. Why? What was the problem in the valley? What did they have? Iron chariots, it says. At that time, a chariot was a very scary piece of military equipment. Imagine you have everybody running around with swords and spears, and now here comes somebody on a raised platform with a sword and a spear who's running around faster than everybody else. And it's not just made of wood, it's made of iron. It's not going to be easily destroyed. That was a serious piece of military equipment. It would be like going up against a tank today. And it says here that Israel didn't win in the valleys because they were seriously outgunned by these iron chariots. We are in a series of sermons looking at how different people of God in the Bible responded to hardships that they faced. And the point is, we want to see what they did right and copy that, because all of us face hardships. And we've looked so far at 3 different individuals in the Bible. We looked at Abraham and Joseph and Naomi. If you remember, Abraham's hardship came in the form of a hard command from God. Remember that? Kill your son. Today we have hard commands from God too. Not quite that bad. But we have hard commands from God, and we need to know what to do when God gives us a hard command. Luke 6:27 says, do good to those who hate you. Can you think of someone who hates you? God commands you, do good to them. I want you to go out of your way and do something good for them. That can be a very hard command to obey. But by watching Abraham, he teaches us to blindly obey God when he gives you a hard command. Doesn't matter if you understand, doesn't matter if it makes sense, doesn't matter if you want to. God says, if you will blindly obey me, you will know blessings, rich blessings upon your life, and grow closer to me. Abraham teaches us that. Then we study the life of Joseph. You remember, Joseph didn't face a hard command. He faced evil mistreatment. Evil mistreatments from his brothers who betrayed him, and then later he was betrayed in the same way by the evil wife of Potiphar. He ends up in prison, and his example teaches us that mistreatment doesn't stop God's hand leading you to good. Mistreatment does not stop God's hand leading you toward good. All these terrible things happened to him. God's hand said, yep, we're just going to keep leading you. Yep, you're in jail. We'll just keep leading you. Yep, you're a slave. I'll just keep leading you. And that teaches us, look, when you're mistreated, keep trusting God. That person can't derail you from the path that God has for you. Like Joseph, put your head down, give God your best, and keep looking beyond the hardship into the good that is coming. It's promised. And then the last time we looked at this, we looked at Naomi. Remember Naomi? She teaches us how to deal with great loss. She faced the great loss of going to a foreign country and then losing her husband. Now she has no provider, but at least she has her sons. But then she loses her 2 sons. Now she's in a foreign country with no provider. She's a widow. And her family line's gone. Do you remember her reaction? It was to turn inward and become bitter. For years, she struggled with bitterness. She told people, change my name to bitterness, because that's what God has done to me. She's an example of what not to do when you experience loss. Because what do we see by the end of her life? God took her, this woman living in unnecessary years of bitterness when she could have been putting her faith in God like Joseph and Abraham. She didn't trust God, experienced this wretched bitterness, and then at the end of her life, God leads her to the good place that he was intending to bring her all along. She had just looked over her loss at where God was promising to take her. She could have avoided years of being bitter. So in our loss, look beyond it to the good that God promises, and don't let bitterness capture your heart. All these are valuable lessons for us to learn from people in the Bible. Today we're looking at one more example, and that is Israel. And it's how Israel faced overwhelming circumstances. They faced iron chariots. These things were way outmatched them. Unbelievably, the odds were against them. And how did Israel respond? Well, I think you and I could say that we've had iron chariots in our lives, things that overwhelmed us, things that we look at and we say, there's no way I can do that. There's no way I can overcome that. It might be, a personal problem that you've tried to get rid of for years, a language problem, an eating problem, an anger problem. And you just say, well, I can't overcome that. I've tried, and it's an overwhelming enemy. I can't defeat it. Or it might be an illness that you feel overwhelmed by that you can't overcome. It might be a person in your life that you've never been able to get along with. It might be, well, what about this? Imagine we wake up tomorrow morning and we hear on the news, New York City and Washington, D.C. are gone. They've been hit by nuclear bombs. Not just 9/11, the whole city's gone, and our nation is under attack. That would be an overwhelming situation, wouldn't it? What would we do? Well, what we don't want to do is what Israel did. Because in Israel's situation, when they faced the overwhelming circumstances of iron chariots, they were defeated because they made two errors. Two errors. We're going to look at both those errors and find out what they did wrong so that we, whenever we face something, even a nation under attack, that we'll be able to do the right thing and respond the right way. So think of something that is overwhelming to you this morning, right now. Now, listen to what God has to say on how to respond when those type of situations, to that situation for you. Let's look at this. Verse 19, going back to that verse, says that Israel was defeated because of iron chariots. Is that true? Is that why Israel was really defeated? That was the surface issue, but that's not why Israel was defeated. How do I know that? Because what did God promise to Joshua in the first verses we read this morning? Be strong and courageous, because no one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life. Wherever you step, I'm going to give you that land. So we know they weren't defeated because of these iron chariots. God had not left their side. God was certainly more powerful than these iron chariots. Why were they defeated then? They were defeated because Israel failed to do her part of being strong and courageous. Remember, that was the condition. Be strong and courageous, because I'm going to give you this land. Well, what if you're not strong and courageous? Why did Israel fail? They saw the iron chariots and their faith in God collapsed. In your insert, the first reason they were defeated. Israel was defeated, number one, because of lack of faith in God's promises. Lack of faith in God's promises. Very simple. We said before that faith is the cord that plugs into God's power outlet. God is a power outlet. Our faith is the cord that plugs itself into it. So you have a centurion hears that Jesus can heal, and he's got a very sick slave, and he puts faith in Jesus to heal him, and wham, that servant is healed. Why? He plugged into his faith into the power of God. Then you have the people of Nazareth who also heard that Jesus could heal and doubted that he could do it. It says that Jesus went to that town and he could do no miracles, it says. Why? Is Jesus powerless? No. They didn't plug their faith into Jesus' power. Here in this circumstance, Israel believes God can defeat the normal enemy in the hills. He can do that, and they took the hills. But down there on the plain where they have these iron chariots, these tanks, no, nobody can do that. And so they withdrew their faith from God's plug of power and were defeated. We've said in the past that every problem we face has two ends of the log. I put a log on your insert there. There's God's end and there's our end to uphold. It doesn't matter what the problem is, a personal weakness or an illness or our nation being attacked. Every problem has two ends of a log. Here in this situation, it was Israel needing to defeat the enemies in the land. There were two ends of this log. Every problem has that. God's end, what is God's end? In every situation, God's end is to provide his promises. I'm going to give you my promises. And our end is to believe the promises. Not difficult to understand. I will give you promises, and you will believe my promises, and will be able to carry this log. When Israel faced defeating the people of the promised land, God's end was, wherever you walk, I will give you that. Okay? Just go out there and fight, and you'll win. And Israel's job, to believe it. That's all they need to do. God said it. I'm going to plug into that promise. But they didn't. They dropped their end of the log and were defeated when it came to the iron chariots. We must keep that from happening to us. So in your problem today, the thing that's overwhelmingly, the first thing that you need to do is find out what's God's promise for it. What is God's promise for your overwhelming situation? I put on the back side of your inserts there a list of God's promises during hardships. I want us to read them together out loud in a minute. And as we do this, I want you to think of what promise you need to hear this morning. So let's read this together. We'll skip the references, just read the verses. God's promises during hardship. Read with me. When you need guidance, who is the man who fears the Lord? He will instruct him in the way he should choose. When you are afraid, God has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. So we may confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. When you feel defeated, God works all things together for good to those who love God. When you feel inadequate, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. When you are needy, he will deliver the needy when he cries for help. When you feel overwhelmed, cast your burden upon the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to fall. So the first step in defeating an overwhelming circumstance isn't just to run and hide, to grow bitter, or whatever the wrong reactions are. Is find what's God's promise about this thing. And for you right now, which one of those applies the most to your circumstances that you're going through? That's the first thing to identify. Then the second step is you got to believe it. You got to believe it. You don't let the overwhelming odds cause you to doubt. You kill doubt when it comes, and you choose belief. You know, doubt is a feeling. You just say, no, I'm not going there. I once talked to someone and they said, I'm facing the surgery. I'm just so full of doubt. How do you get it to go away? You get it away by killing it and choosing belief. You say, no, I'm not going to unbelieve. I'm going to believe that God works all things together for good, and that includes the surgery. God calls us to be courageous and believe in spite of the odds against you. Be courageous and believe in spite of the odds against you. That's what God says. When overwhelming odds face you, don't make the mistake Israel did of not believing. Courageously believe. You need to apply that to something in your life today. Have you not been believing one of these promises? First step, believe. We're going to find a second reason Israel was defeated by our enemies, jumping down to verse 27. Judges 1:27. It says, but Manasseh, that's another tribe of Israel, but Manasseh did not take possession of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. So the Canaanites persisted in living in that land. And it came about when Israel became strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. All right, here's a long list of the enemies of God that he promised, I'll defeat them. And what? They're not defeated. Why? Because Israel never went to battle against them. They didn't stand up against them. They insisted on living in the land, and they said, okay, and gave up. They had the promise they could drive them out, but they didn't do it. Second reason Israel was defeated, in your inserts. The second reason Israel was defeated because of lack of faithfulness to their responsibilities. Lack of faithfulness to their responsibilities. What did God command Israel to do to the people of the promised land? To defeat them and take their cities. But instead of obeying God, it lists 5 cities in these verses that they just let live there. They didn't defeat them and remove them. They just let them live there. 5 cities in these verses. Verse 29 lists another city, Ephraim. Verse 30 lists Zebulun. Verse 31 and 32 lists Asher, and the list goes on and on. Israel just let all these people stay there instead of fighting them. You can say, well, it says that they ultimately became their slaves, so in a sense they did defeat them, right? What did God command Israel to do? Make them slaves? No, defeat them and get rid of them. Israel did not obey God, and what happens when you don't obey God? Well, it's not always bad. It's always bad. You just don't always recognize or feel it. God gives us commands for our welfare. When we don't obey those commands, things go bad, whether we realize it or not. How did it affect Israel? You're supposed to get rid of all these people living here. No, we're not going to do it. We're going to let them live. What are the consequences of that choice? Jump to chapter 3. Judges chapter 3. This is the last time I'm turning you. Judges 3, verse 5. This is the consequences of what happened. Judges 3:5. The sons of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and they took their daughters for themselves as wives, and gave their own daughters to their sons, and served their gods. The sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served the Baals and the Asherah idols. God commanded Israel to remove the people of the land for their welfare. He knew if they did not remove them, they would be a bad influence, pull them away from God. That's exactly what happened. They were promised, just go and remove them, they'll be defeated. They didn't do it, and it ended up being defeated by those very people because they drew them away from God. So this gives us 2 reasons why Israel was not able to defeat the enemies. Why are we not defeating our enemies? Number 1, because of lack of faith in God's promise. He can't overcome iron chariots, so they didn't believe it and they didn't defeat him. And the second one in here is lack of faithfulness to their responsibilities. They were supposed to go in and remove them. They had God's promise to be able to do it. They said, no, we're not going to do it, and then ended up being defeated because they wouldn't completely obey God. Many people make the mistake of focusing all their attention on God's end of the log. God says, I will provide all your needs. And they'll say, hey, God said he'll provide all my needs. I don't need to do anything. I can just sit back and everything will take care of itself. And then they get financial problems because they're not working hard or holding a job like they should. And they think, God's abandoned me. God didn't keep his promise. He said he provided all my needs. And look, I've got these financial problems. One end of the log is God says, I will provide all your needs. The other end of the log is keeping your responsibilities regarding that issue. And what are our responsibilities to have the money we need? God's promise, I'll provide everything, but we've covered them many times. 4 things God says to have the money you need. You got to work hard. Second, you got to save some aside instead of spending it all. Spend wisely, not foolishly. And give generously to the needy. God says, you do those 4 things, you'll have all the money I want you to have. That's your end of the log. But what if you drop your end of the log and you don't work hard? What if you don't save? What if you don't spend wisely? Spend on things you shouldn't buy. And what if you don't give generously to those who are in need? Then you drop that into the log, and that log's not going anywhere. Not because God failed. He has his promises, but you dropped your faithfulness to your responsibilities. This means carrying the log requires both arms. Are both arms. One arm is faith in God, and the other arm is faithfulness to our responsibilities. Okay? You can have all the faith of God, but then not do your responsibilities, and that log, you're not going to be able to carry it. On the other hand, you can do all your responsibilities and not have faith in God, and you're not going to be able to carry it. Carrying your end takes faith in God, the arm of faith in God, and the arm of faithfulness to your responsibilities. Just what are our responsibilities and hardship? That's the other list I put on the back of your insert. If you look at your insert again, if you remember years ago we looked at what we called our airport cards. They are 7 responsibilities God gives us in hardship. If you've got a hardship, you always want to test these 7 things. Are you doing these? Are you leaving any of them out? Because if you leave out any of these 7 things, you're likely not to get through it. It'll be dropping your end of the log. So what I'd like us to do is read through these again together out loud. And as we read them, ask yourself, am I doing each one of these? Whatever hardship you're facing today, test yourself to see if you're doing these. Let's read these aloud together, and again, we'll leave off the references. Our responsibilities during hardship. Number 1, advice. Seek solutions from the Bible and godly counsel. Number 2, importance. Keep God the highest concern of your life. Resist. Fight all demonic involvement. Pray, ask and seek and knock. Obey. Close all open doors of sin. Rejoice. Focus on what is going right. And trust. Expect to experience God's promises. Are you doing all 7 of those? That's carrying your end of the log in your hardship. I was talking to someone recently who was having a difficulty finding a job, and I told them that I'd be praying for them, and they looked at me and they said, you know, I can honestly say I haven't been praying about it myself. And they prayed that evening. They called me the next day. They said, guess what happened? I was driving to work, and a company out of the blue who I really had no contact with, but someone there knew me, called and asked if he would like them to come work for them. Just one prayer. But he had dropped his end of the log. When you face overwhelming odds, God says, grab your end of the log with both arms. Faith in God must, but also faithfulness to your responsibility. So if you've got a personal failure that you can't overcome, faith in God. What? God's help, I can overcome anything. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But also faithfulness. What do you got to do with a personal failure? Cry to God for help. Ask, seek, knock. What about a difficult illness? Faith that God works all things together for good. Faithfulness to focus your thoughts on the things that are going right, not the things that are going wrong. Faithfulness to attend to your health in a responsible way. It's the sick who need a physician, Jesus said. What about waking up tomorrow morning and hearing that the United States is under attack? Panic, fear, run? No. Faith in God. God will never leave us or forsake us. We can confidently say, God is my helper. But then also faithfulness to our responsibilities. What is it? Number 1, love God and love others. Look around and do as much good as you can do for your family, for the people around you. Honor God. Don't panic and fear. Uphold your end of the log with faith in God and faithfulness to your responsibilities. What do you do when you are believing? You're holding up the arm of faith. You are believing God, and you are faithful to all your responsibilities. You read through these lists and you say, Pastor, I can't see where I could be doing anything any better. Well, many have concluded that God has failed them. Like, I did everything God said to do, and still things went terrible. Look, when you feel like God has failed you, think again. In spite of what you may have heard, God can't do everything. No, God can't fail. God cannot fail you. That's one thing God can't do. He could try and he just can't do it. If you feel like God has failed you and dropped his end of the log, realize he doesn't do that. If it's not working right, you got to look at your end of the log. Number 1, ask yourself, are you believing or doubting God's promises? Believing or doubting God's promises? Number two, are you faithful or unfaithful to your responsibilities? And if you say, you know what, I look at these lists that are on the back of the insert, I'm saying, I'm doing all this, then you do what God's people have done for centuries. Persevere. You just keep doing the same thing. You keep at it and being faithful. God's not left you, it's just not the right time. Persevere. Joseph was in prison for how many years? A decade or more? He could have given in to despair and anger and yelling at God. What did he do? He just kept at, God is faithful, and I'm going to be faithful to my responsibilities. Faithfulness and faithfulness to my responsibilities. Faith and faithfulness. Faith and faithfulness. You have Job, could have collapsed under the torments that he went under. What did he do? He just kept persevering. Faith and faithfulness. Faith and faithfulness. And that's what God calls you and me to do. If you look at that list on the back of those inserts, you say, I'm doing this. Just keep doing it. Do it and do it and do it. Faith in God, faithfulness to responsibilities. And that will mature you, God says. That will make you into being more like God in your character. That's God's goal for you. You be just like him in your character. And it's these times of persevering, like that song says, where it feels like God's not answering me. Just keep praying, being faithful. Don't give up. Psalm 100 says, the Lord is good. His loving kindness is everlasting, and his faithfulness is to all generations. That's true. Don't give up on God. Keep persevering if you're doing everything you know to do. So the lesson on hardship this week has to do with Israel facing these iron chariots, these overwhelming odds. And they were truly outmatched by the iron chariots on a human level. But that's not why they were defeated. Years later, in Israel, a shepherd boy would stand before a military giant, and he was truly outmatched. The odds were overwhelmingly against him, and yet he won anyway. Why? Well, just like every other boy in Israel, David had heard the promises that God gave to Joshua. David grew up and knew that God said, be strong and courageous. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given to you. David knew about that promise, but unlike every other boy in Israel, unlike every other man in Israel, including the king, he was the only one who believed it, who plugged himself into that promise and went out and fought the giant and defeated him. David defeated Goliath because he did two things: faith in God and faithfulness to his responsibilities to go and fight, both arms. Let's be like David. In your hardship that you're facing today, say no to panic and fear and grab hold of it with both arms. Put your faith in that God's promise to you and faithfulness to do what he's told you to do, and then just keep doing it until it's over. Is there anything you need to change? Anything God's laid his finger upon you right now? You need to change that. Change it. Tell him to change it. God has promised us victory in the end. Let's not be defeated needlessly like Israel was.